today's edition of Yesterday's News as seen by Tobe Reed. From San Francisco, we present Tobe Reed and his little-known and seldom-spun yarns drawn from the entertaining and dramatic side of yesterday's news. And here is Tobe Reed.
How do you do, everyone? And again, we suggest that you string along with us for a quarter of an hour, exploring the private lives of real people. The great, the small, the famous, and the infamous ones, names, places, and events, as they appear in today's edition of Yesterday's News. Today, we find ourselves slightly confused as to just what constitutes a good, peaceful story. We could speak of romance, but that's a subject with which everyone is quite familiar. We could talk of politics, but then we won't. Then there's cabbages and kings, but we know very little about cabbages, and there are too few real live kings. And so we turn back the pages of the past to our customary Wednesday memory pictures. Today you lounge in the luxury of your living room and hear your favorite music. You laugh with your favorite comedian, shed a tear with the singer of your choice, while the announcer sells you everything from hairpins to rubber tires. But do you remember this day in 1919 when the family huddled around a crystal set, anxiously awaiting their turn to clamp a pair of earphones over their heads? Those were the happy days, for the world's bad boys had put away their guns. Stocks and women's skirts were climbing skyward. The name of Charlie McCarthy held the headlines, not as a wooden-headed stooge, but as the man who had been named governor of the Hawaiian Islands. The talk along Financial Row was the third issue of Liberty Bonds, and brass bands announced the arrival of a rhythm known as jazz, while the nation's cosmopolites, in accordance with the laws of prohibition, were trying to develop a taste for near beer. And in every part of town, people were spending their evenings huddled about the most revolutionary invention of them all. Do you remember that first crystal set, which demanded delicate nerves and infinite patience to catch a few words or a few bars of music? Then next it was the battery number, and invariably the batteries went dead when you planned to hear your favorite program. Then followed the super heterodyne with a huge black speaker. And finally, down to today and the modern all-wave console that in a few seconds transports you to foreign lands, allows you to listen in on the nation's party line and share the informal chatter of 1,000 ham operators calling CQ from every corner of the world. These are the Minutemen of radio, which brings us to the first of 5 memorable scenes taken from the pages of yesterday's news. The setting is somewhere on a barren field of ice in northern Alaska, where an unknown ham operator sits before his transmitter, tirelessly repeating over and over, "This is Nome, Alaska calling. This is Nome, Alaska calling. Diphtheria epidemic. Send serum. 6 dead. 20 dying. Please hurry. Nome, Alaska calling. Nome, Alaska calling." Within 24 hours, the eyes of the nation focused on stricken Nome, Alaska, and a half dozen of the Northland's greatest mushers driving through blinding blizzards and across fields of ice to answer the call of an unknown amateur operator, one whose name somehow escaped the roster of great American heroes. Scene 2 is set in the radio control room of a national network studios in Chicago. In the control chamber, surrounded by bakelite panels, meters, dials, and patch sections, a monitor man sits with earphones clamped over his head. Before him is a delicate meter on which he trains a practiced eye, for he is controlling the volume of a descriptive broadcast emanating from a point in New Jersey. Beside him, another technician anxiously watches the sapphire point of an electrical recording machine carefully groove a permanent record of this broadcast. Then suddenly the jeweled cutting needle jumps completely off the wax disc. The recording engineer shoots an incredulous glance at the monitor man, who has torn the phones from his head. Bewildered, he presses his hands to his ears, then dumbly signals for the needle to be replaced. Trembling with excitement now, the two men gaze at that revolving disc, and this is something like what they heard. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Herbert Morrison speaking to you from Lakehurst, where a huge crowd has assembled to watch the giant Hindenburg complete its first Atlantic crossing of 1937. The huge ship is directly over the field right now. The anchor lines have been hurled to the ground. The field crew is out there at the moment, racing out to take up that slack. The aft motors are still turning slowly, holding the Hindenburg just enough to keep it But at this point, there was a flaw in that record, where a terrific blast of sound completely shattered broadcasting equipment at a dozen different points. When the sapphire needle was replaced, the voice continued. It's burst into flame. It's hanging like a cloud of fire over the field. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to have to stop. I've lost my voice. And there you have the world tragedy of 1937. The Hindenburg disaster as it was presented to you, the radio audience, before being recorded in the pages of yesterday's news. Scene number 3. A group of firemen at a Sacramento precinct station are listening to the radio broadcast of a Pacific Coast League ball game. The enthusiastic voice booming from the loudspeaker of their set is that of Ernie Smith, a San Francisco sport commentator. Accurately, the radio spieler describes the color and the excitement of the game being played on the field as well as the reaction of the spectators in the stands. Then at the most exciting part of that game, a screaming fire siren filtered through behind the voice, a familiar sound which brought the firemen out of their chairs. A moment later, the commentator admitted that although he could not actually see the fire, he was convinced that it must be nearby because he could detect the unmistakable sign of smoke in the air just beyond the right field fence. Unknowingly, Ernie Smith went on describing the ball game, while 8 members of his audience leaped for a brass pole, climbed into a fire truck, and roared away in the direction of the Sacramento baseball park. At the scene which had been so vividly described by Ernie Smith, the confused firemen became even more confused by the absence of any evidence whatsoever of a fire. Finally, of course, they gave up and returned to their station. And it wasn't until several days later that they actually learned what had happened. That the ball game being played in Sacramento had been broadcast from a San Francisco studio. That Ernie Smith, capturing the excitement of the game from a series of teletype messages, recreated the play-by-play action, while a clever sound technician supplied the cheering of the spectators, the cheering of the spectators, the cheering of the spectators by means of recorded sound on phonograph records. That during the most exciting part of that game, the sound expert had absent-mindedly placed a record of a fire siren on the turntable. And to cover the technician's error, the surprised radio spieler commented on a fire truck racing by the ballpark. A few moments later, as an added precaution, he suggested that he saw smoke rising from beyond the right field fence. And so it was that Ernie Smith, the San Francisco sports commentator, without knowing it, became a sort of hero in the eyes of his sound technician, an unpleasant memory in the minds of 8 firemen at a Sacramento precinct station, and gained the distinction of being the first man to actually turn in a false fire alarm by radio. It's said to be true, but true or false, it's a good story and supplies a touch of humor to the serious business of radio. And now to scene number 4, set in the office of a small New Jersey newspaper. It is one of those warm, sultry nights just 11 months ago. A hard-shelled night editor, resting his feet on the city desk, leans back wearily and sighs,
I can remember when there was a page 1 story a day in this country. Now we haven't had one for a week. You know, people are getting pretty tired of reading of Mrs. Algernon Plunkett's pink tea parties.
As if in answer to his lament, the sharp peal of a telephone bell interrupted.
Hello, is this the Daily Record? Well, look, man, we got to do something. I'm not going to stand by and see my family wiped out. I'm a taxpayer, and I want protection. Send the police, send the National Guard, the Army. By heavens, I want help.
It seemed to be in the air on that evening of October 30th. For at practically that same moment, the switchboards of the country were plugged with frantic calls for help. Telephone operators wore blisters on their hands, answering 1 million calls from Seattle to Tallahassee. City editors across the country sat unwilling to believe their own ears as one call after another poured into the nation's news factories. In various parts of the country, women collapsed from fear. Men bundled their families into automobiles and headed for the wide-open spaces. And while hysteria soared to a brand-new high in the United States, a tall, hulking sort of chap calmly went about the business of directing a cast of New York's better radio dramatists. Under the school guidance of this youthful fellow, each member of the cast took his cue and portrayed his part with the skill of a Shakespearean actor, bringing to life the characters that lived only in the scripts the actors held in their hands. Occasionally, an announcer in the far corner of the studio would interrupt the continuity to announce, "Ladies and gentlemen, confirming the report you heard just a few moments ago by Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory, Chicago, we have just received word that a meteorite has landed in New Jersey. Emerging from it are a number of huge men that stand an estimated 9 feet in height, believed to be from the planet Mars. These giant creatures have spread through New Jersey and New York, dealing death and destruction with a mysterious cosmic ray." Today we know what a few million people didn't know on that October evening, that it was simply an Orson Welles radio production extraordinary. At 4 different times during the broadcast, as a precautionary measure, it was announced that this was purely a fictional play based on H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. But apparently those announcements were lost in the mad hysteria that swept the nation. And strangely enough, it wasn't until the next morning that 23-year-old Orson Welles suddenly came to the realization that he was the biggest news of October 31st, 1938. Today there are thousands who remember the chilling terror of those few misunderstood but horror-filled moments, while literally millions have become conscious of radio as an invaluable source of instantaneous information. And finally, we come to scene number 5 and our final scene, which takes us into a great room lighted by the soft glow from a massive chandelier. Exquisite paintings line the walls of this room, portraits of characters who belong on the pages of a 17th century novel. Faces which on this night seem to wear a sympathetic sort of expression as they look down on a lone man standing in the center of this luxurious but melancholy setting. A man whose life, paradoxically enough, at this moment has come to a tragic end and has found a romantic beginning. Almost timidly, the solitary figure straightens, summons his last ounce of courage, and speaks. A procession of words captured by the ears of the English-speaking world and translated into every foreign language, which began with, "At long last, I am able to say a few words on my own," reached its emotional crest with the simple confession, "But you must believe me when I tell you I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and the support of the woman I love," and was brought to a dramatic conclusion with the sincere benediction, "God bless you all. God save the king." And so it was that radio presented to the world the abdication of King Edward VII and the beginning of the 20th century's most storybook romance, which we feel is about enough talk of radio in today's edition of Yesterday's News. Until we join you next Wednesday at the same hour, Tobe Reed bids you all a good afternoon.
From San Francisco, we have presented Tobe Reed and today's edition of Yesterday's News with original music by Albert Lachelle. This program was released through the facilities of KFRC and the Don Lee Network. Bob Benz speaking. The Mutual Broadcasting System.